This channel follows containment crews assigned to the kinds of failures that do not explode, burn, or leave debris fields behind. In the late 26th century, humanity has learned to cross stars, but not to outgrow consequence. Procedure matters, discipline matters, and when the threat cannot be fought with weapons, method becomes the only shield that holds. Each story you hear is one case file from the edge of known space. A relay that stayed powered but stopped meaning anything. A signal that learned the rhythm of human attention. And a crew trained to survive not by force, but by restraint. This is Lantern 7, where observation is exposure, competence is courage, and survival depends on knowing when not to look. Vesper Relay had been built to feel mundane. It was a frontier communications hub, an anchor of infrastructure in a region where the stars were more rumor than road. A station like that was supposed to have the same dependable personality as a door that always latched. Steady power, steady traffic, steady procedural noise. It existed so that human presence could remain continuous across distances that did not care. It existed so that the Gloam belt, sparse, exploited, and perpetually a week away from becoming a tragedy, could still pretend it was connected to the rest of civilization by more than faith. When it went silent, it did not do so like a station under attack. There was no debris field, no scorch line on the hull, no emergency beacon flaring like a flare in the dark. No garbled last transmission, no shouted coordinates, no signature of violence that would let the mind file it away in a familiar cabinet. It simply stopped answering the way it was supposed to answer, as if a person had continued breathing but refused to speak. The Terran Commonwealth Naval Service logged the incident as a comms outage. The Directorate of Containment flagged it as a potential anomalous exposure. The Horizon Accord sent 3 messages demanding clarification and received nothing but automated acknowledgements in return, each one dated and formatted correctly, each one blank of meaning. The Free Prospectors Guild complained about lost time and threatened to dispatch its own maintenance crew. In the quiet between those bureaucratic pressures, someone quietly approved a response posture that rarely appeared outside classified annexes. A quarantine cutter was assigned. The TCNS Ardent moved through the mapped lane toward Vesper Relay with the restrained urgency of a ship that had learned the price of haste. Her hull was not large by naval standards, but she carried mass where other vessels carried weaponry, layered shielding, redundant seals, isolation bays, and the kind of internal architecture designed to fail safely rather than dramatically. The Ardent had been built for problems that could not be solved by firing at them. Captain Mara Cade stood on the bridge as the relay's last known coordinates slid closer on the navigation display. She kept her hands still, not because she feared motion, but because stillness disciplined the people around her. The bridge operated with a reduced visual profile under Lantern 7 posture, fewer live feeds, fewer auxiliary windows, a deliberate bias toward instrument cross-checking. The screens that remained were set to high-contrast minimalism, enough to do the job without inviting the mind to go wandering for patterns. Cade did not need to give a speech to make the ship feel the seriousness of the approach. The Ardent's crew had their own memory of what Lantern 7 meant. It meant that an incident could be contagious without being biological. It meant that human attention itself could be a pathway. It meant that confidence was expensive and that procedure was cheaper than regret. At the aft stations, Chief Engineer Lena Voss watched the propulsion envelope and the shield harmonics as the ship throttled down. Voss had the posture of someone who trusted tools the way others trusted prayers, but she was careful now not to overtrust any single tool. She had learned to respect the possibility of readings that were too good to be honest. On the signals console, LT Sierra Nim had already stripped the comms suite to a narrow set of channels. She did not chase the silence directly. She treated the absence itself as data. The relay's transponder was still there, pulsing identity in the expected band, its pattern repeating with the crispness of an untouched clock. But the traffic that should have surrounded it, the low-level pinging of automated maintenance, the chatter of routing handshakes, the background heartbeat of a working hub was missing. The most unsettling part was that the transponder's clarity did not degrade with time. It did not drift or wobble. It did not show the tiny imperfections that came with thermal cycles and frontier-grade power systems. It was almost too clean, as if someone had polished it for inspection. Master Atom's Juno Pike moved along the bridge perimeter, checking seal status indicators on the bulkheads and the interlocks on access points. Pike's work was always physical even when it was procedural, as if the act of confirming a latch with a glance was not enough and the muscles needed to remember too. Her presence was not threatening, it was stabilizing. She carried rules the way a medic carried antiseptic, not as punishment, but as prevention. Dr. Ishan Rao, the ardent xenocognition specialist, stood just behind the command seats. Rao was not a religious man, but his discipline had the quiet intensity of one. He watched posture, micro-movements, the slight changes in breathing that arrived when a mind began to reach for certainty it had not earned. He did not correct people in the moment unless he had to. He saved interventions for when they mattered, because unnecessary correction could become its own form of repetition. Rook, the ship's restricted oversight kernel, provided correlation across systems without indulging in interpretation. The AI was throttled by design, permitted to notice inconsistencies, but forbidden from consuming raw pattern-dense feeds. It did what it could. It flagged that the relay's power signature, as read at range, was stable to an improbable degree. Cade watched the alert and did not react outwardly. She had seen this kind of stability before, in incidents that had tried to convince humans that everything was normal so that humans would relax the one thing that kept them safe. As the Ardent closed to visual range, Vesper Relay emerged as a pale geometry against the starfield. It was not a graceful structure. It was utilitarian, a central spindle with habitat rings, radiators, docking collars, and the long arms of its comma rays reaching outward like skeletal wings. Navigation lights blinked in regulation timing. The station rotated slowly, keeping its artificial gravity consistent. Everything about it suggested continuity, yet the space around it felt wrong. There was no drift of maintenance drones, no glimmer of outbound traffic, no wake of micro-impacts that usually surrounded any structure in a working corridor. The relay was suspended in a cleanliness that did not match its environment, like a surface that had not collected dust in a house that should have been lived in. Cade ordered the ship into a holding pattern outside the relay's automated docking envelope. She did not let the station's systems guide the Ardent in. That was not paranoia, it was doctrine. Anomalies did not need to be clever in every dimension. They only needed one opening. The Ardent extended its own hardened docking probe, a tool designed to connect without granting authority. Voss confirmed the mechanical constraints and the shielding. Pike confirmed the quarantine corridors were configured. Rao confirmed the exposure rotation schedule, which would be followed even if nothing went wrong, because the absence of obvious wrongness was not evidence of safety. Nim initiated a passive listen. She did not open the comms wide. She chose a narrow band and began filtering the station's emissions through analog stages, hardware that could be trusted more than software when the threat was information itself. The hiss that came back was ordinary at first, just the soft static of space and station electronics. Then beneath it, there was a regularity, not a message, not words, a pulse. A steady carrier buried under the noise, thin and unwavering. Nim's fingers tightened slightly on the console edge without her realizing it. Her mind did what all minds did in the presence of regularity. It reached to name it. She stopped herself, made herself breathe, and let her instruments do the naming instead. The frequency resolved in the readout with indifferent clarity, 13.7 kilohertz. It was too deliberate to be incidental, not because a station could not produce that frequency, any number of systems could resonate there, but because it held steady across power fluctuations that should have introduced drift. It sat inside the static as if it belonged there, and the longer Nim watched, the more the rest of the noise seemed to align around it, as if the chaos had been arranged to make the carrier easier to find. Cade did not ask for an explanation out loud. She did not need one. She saw Nim's focus shift into the narrow band of concentration that meant a pattern had shown itself. Cade made a decision that would shape everything that followed. They would board. They would not treat Vesper Relay as hostile in a military sense. They would treat it as contaminated in a procedural sense. They would move like surgeons entering an operating theater where the patient's blood might carry something the gloves were not designed to stop. The boarding team was small by design. Cade, Pike, Nim, Rao, and a single systems technician selected for steadiness more than brilliance. Voss remained aboard to keep the Ardent stable and to act as a remote anchor point. Rook would remain constrained and watch for deviations in the team's telemetry. The airlock cycle began with mechanical inevitability. Seal indicators went green. Pressures equalized. The Ardent's docking collar kissed the relay's collar with a muted shudder that was felt more than heard. Pike watched the gauge needles and did not blink until the numbers settled. The station's interlock accepted the connection without challenge, and for a brief moment that compliance felt almost like a welcome. Then the door opened. The first thing the team noticed was that the air smelled filtered but stale, as if the station's recyclers were working but no one had thought to refresh the chemical scrubbers in days. The second thing they noticed was sound, or the lack of it. Stations had their own acoustics, ventilation hum, the faint tremor of pumps, the irregular click of thermal panels adjusting. Vesper's corridors had a hum, but it was subdued, smoothed down, as if the station had been padded. The silence was not absolute. It was curated. Their suit displays would have offered them live schematic overlays and automated hazard labels, but Rao had already insisted on reduced display mode. The team moved with their helmets in passive configuration, their tools simple. Pike carried a manual seal kit. Nim carried an analog recorder and a filtered receiver that she treated like a biohazard container. Rao carried nothing visible but had the most important equipment, a set of procedures that could keep the mind from becoming a doorway. They advanced down the first corridor and saw the first of the station's cameras. It was mounted at a corner junction, standard security hardware. Its lens was uncovered. Its indicator light was active. That alone was normal. What was not normal was the angle. It was pointed outward, not down the corridor, as if the station's attention had been reoriented toward the approaching ship. Further along, they found another camera and another. Some were turned toward docking points, some toward access hatches, some toward the intersections where a person might pause and glance around. Each one was active. Each one was a small eye that implied the station was watching, and the longer a person spent under those eyes, the more a subtle, almost physical pressure built in the mind, an urge to look back. Rao noticed the change in posture first, a slight tilt of the head, a fraction too long spent focusing on the lens. Not fascination exactly, but the mind's instinct to complete a loop. Watched, therefore watch. He slowed the team not by ordering them to stop, but by inserting a small procedural break, touch the checklist, confirm the seal integrity, confirm the route. The act forced their attention away from the cameras and toward their own controlled anchors. At the first junction, a maintenance panel had been left open. Behind it, cables were neatly bundled and labeled. The labeling was new. The tags were too crisp, as if someone had recently relabeled the entire bundle. That would have been commendable under normal circumstances. Under Lantern 7, it was a red flag. Tidying could be a symptom, order could be a mask. They reached the station's control hub without encountering anyone. That was itself an absence loud enough to feel. Vespa Relay should have had at least 2 personnel in transit, at least 1 drone, at least 1 sign of routine life. Instead, the corridors were staged, clean floor panels, intact signage, immaculate handrails. The control hub door was unlocked. Inside, lights were bright, consoles were active. The station's main display wall showed routing diagrams and traffic maps that looked plausible at a glance, but when Nim forced herself to examine them closely, she saw that the maps were almost empty. The diagrams displayed the outlines of routes without any moving data. It was the image of functionality, not the substance. And the wall of screens did something else. It faced outward. Rather than offering the operators a view of internal station systems, the display wall was configured as a bank of external cameras, docking collars, corridor corners, access hatches, the approach vector where the Ardent floated. The station was watching its own watchers. The central operator chair was occupied. A technician sat with an upright posture that suggested attention. Their hands moved occasionally, not with urgency but with dutiful rhythm, tapping controls that produced no obvious changes. Their eyes tracked the display wall, scanning from camera to camera with steady microsaccades. They did not startle at the team's entry. They did not turn with surprise. They continued their observation, as if the presence of strangers in sealed suits was part of normal operations. Rao watched for signs of panic or confusion. There were none. The technician's face was calm in a way that felt rehearsed. Pike did not approach too close. She signaled the team into a standard containment posture, perimeter established, line of retreat maintained, nothing touched without necessity. Cade kept her body language neutral, not threatening, not soft. She let the scene speak. Nim held her receiver up and listened for the 13.7 kHz carrier. It was present here, stronger beneath the console noise. It was not the station's main power harmonic. It was separate, threaded through the electronics like a filament. Rao directed his attention to the technician's work surfaces. Everything was labeled, everything was ordered. The log terminal displayed maintenance entries, routine checks, sensor calibrations, handshake confirmations. The entries were so neat they felt like a story about a station rather than the station itself. They contained no frustration, no notes, no human irregularity. In a functioning station, logs were messy. Humans wrote with annoyance and fatigue. They abbreviated. They complained. Their words left fingerprints of personality. Vesper's logs had been scrubbed until they were technically correct and emotionally empty. Cade made a choice that felt like stepping onto a floor whose integrity could not be trusted. She moved close enough to view the log entries without leaning in, without letting her helmet camera dwell on them longer than necessary. Even her caution had to be measured. Too much caution could become a tension. The technician's identification badge was visible. The name was there, printed precise. Cade noticed something subtle. The badge had been cleaned. The plastic was too clear, the surface unmarred. Like the cable tags, it suggested recent reordering. The station's intercom system showed active channels, but none carried sound. The public address queue listed automated announcements that had been scheduled and then cancelled, scheduled and then cancelled in a repeating pattern. The queue itself was a kind of heartbeat, an attempt to speak, perpetually deferred. Nim recognized the structure of the cancellations. The timestamps were evenly spaced, too evenly spaced. No human had made those choices. Something had. She did not tell anyone in a way that would create a focal point. Under Lantern 7, information was handled like a sharp tool, carefully, deliberately, and without swinging it around. Cade began the station's continuity checks. She instructed Pike to locate the physical comm junctions and confirm whether Vesper's external transmitters were intact. She instructed Rao to find living quarters and locate any remaining crew. She instructed Nim to keep her receiver narrow and to avoid opening a full spectrum analysis. Rao moved through the station's habitat ring with the same cautious pace he used in medical wards. He noted details that would have meant nothing to most people: a mug left on a table, still clean, a personal photo frame turned face down, a bunk made with a precision that could have been pride or compulsion. It was as if the station had been cleaned after a tragedy, but the tragedy had not yet been acknowledged. In the mess hall, food dispensers were stocked. The refrigeration units hummed. The environment was not failing. The station was not dying. It was simply paused. At the end of a corridor lined with crew quarters, Rao found the first group of survivors. 3 technicians and 1 supervisor were gathered in a lounge area. They sat spaced evenly, not too close, not too far. Their eyes tracked a small monitor on the wall that displayed a looping external camera feed, the ardent docked at the collar, the boarding hatch, the corridor outside their lounge. The feed had no sound. The people watching it did not speak. Their attention held to the screen with a calm that felt like sedation. Rao's presence did not break the loop at first. The group looked at him briefly and then returned to the monitor, as if their task was to observe. Their expressions did not show fear. Their faces showed something like compliance. He began his screening without drawing attention to the monitor. He approached at an angle that minimized the screen's presence in his peripheral vision. He used his physical checklist as a focal anchor. He made his own body a signal of steadiness. The survivors responded to basic questions with correct details delivered in a manner that felt memorized. Their work roles were described accurately. Their last maintenance cycle was described accurately. Their account of the outage was vague in the same precise way, a series of statements that contained no measurable moment of failure. When Rao attempted to probe for sensory details, the sound of the first anomaly, the exact moment they realized comms were gone, each answer slid into the same shape: reassurance, normalcy, smoothness. Their stories disagreed in small ways that should have mattered, but were presented as if they did not. The disagreements were synchronized, like variations produced from a single template. Rao's mind, trained to detect the edges where cognition frayed, identified the first consistent symptom. The survivors did not volunteer uncertainty. Humans, when frightened, often filled gaps with speculation. Humans, when honest, often admitted they could not remember. These survivors offered neither. They offered certainty over and over, with the calm persistence of a machine repeating a status report. The monitor continued to show the corridor outside. The group continued to watch. Rao knew that arguing with them would be pointless and potentially harmful. He needed to remove them from the exposure vector without turning their attention into a fight. He needed to shift their task. He did so by assigning them a different form of observation: physical, tactile, procedural. He guided them into a sequence of steps that required their hands, packing personal essentials, checking suit seals, verifying badge IDs, moving through the station's corridors toward the quarantine corridor. As they stood and moved, something changed. Their eyes flickered back toward the monitor with a subtle yearning, as if leaving the feed was like leaving oxygen. The compulsion was not violent, it was gentle. That gentleness was what made it dangerous. At another junction, Pike found what she was looking for and what she had hoped not to find. Vesper's external comm array was intact. Its dishes were aligned. Its power conduits were active. Nothing physical had failed. Yet the outgoing signal buffer was full of nothing. The station was generating routing acknowledgements and maintenance pings, but it was not sending actual traffic. It was like a throat that could hum but not form words. Worse, Pike found that the station's internal camera network had been prioritized in the comm scheduler. The relay's broadcast architecture had been repurposed to service its own eyes. The station was feeding itself observation at the expense of communication. Pike did not touch the camera junction. She noted its configuration and backed away with a tension in her shoulders that did not show as panic, but as the controlled strain of someone holding a door closed with their body. Back at the control hub, Cade and Nim encountered the station's second strangeness. The static was not just noise. It had texture. Nim's receiver, filtered and narrow, captured the ambient comm emissions with exquisite sensitivity. Beneath the 13.7 kHz carrier, there were micro-variations in the noise floor that resembled modulation. Not content, not language, but the shape of effort, the way a person might try to speak through a wall. The longer Nim listened, the more her mind insisted on hearing structure that might not be there. That insistence was itself a symptom. She shifted her gaze from the receiver to a physical meter, then to her own checklist. She forced herself to treat the sound as a chemical hazard, measurable, dangerous, and not something to interpret by instinct. A small alarm flickered on her panel. Her attention had drifted too long into the feed. She adjusted, narrowed, and continued. Cade kept the team moving, because staying in place in a high-observation environment increased exposure. Every camera, every monitor, every blinking indicator was a stimulus that invited a mind to search for meaning. Cade knew that meaning was where the threat lived. They needed to reassert human control over Vesper Relay without giving the anomaly a clear path back out into inhabited space. That meant a delicate operation, restoring the relay's function while isolating whatever had woven itself into its comms and observation systems. Cade established a temporary command point away from the control hub's screen wall. She chose a maintenance annex with minimal displays, bare walls, and enough floor space to lay out physical tools. Voss transmitted a simplified schematic from the Ardent through a one-way data diode, a system that allowed information to flow into Vesper without allowing anything to flow back. The diode was old technology made relevant by new fears. It prevented the station from pushing anything, pattern or otherwise, into the Ardent systems. Rao insisted that all notes taken aboard Vesper be written physically first, then transcribed aboard the Ardent after decontamination. It was not superstition. It was an exposure control strategy. Digital notes could be copied, replayed, magnified. Paper could be folded, filed, and left behind. NIM continued tracking the carrier pulse. 13.7 kHz persisted through every corridor, every junction, every system cluster. It was strongest near the scheduler and the camera network. It did something else too. When the team members moved, the amplitude shifted slightly, as if the station's noise responded to their presence. It was not enough to prove intent. It was enough to raise the hair at the base of the neck beneath the suit collar. Rao noticed another shift. The survivors they had collected, now moving toward the quarantine corridor under Pike's supervision, began to exhibit microsynchronization. Their steps aligned. Their pauses occurred at the same junctions. Their eyes drifted toward the station cameras in the same moments, and their gazes lingered for the same length of time, as if someone had set their attention to a metronome. This was not mind control in the dramatic sense. It was something more insidious, a gentle shaping of behavior around observation loops. A person watched, then looked back, then felt relief. The relief reinforced the action. The action reinforced the loop. Over hours, the loop became normal. The station had turned watching into a self-soothing behavior. In the maintenance annex, Cade laid out their objectives the way she laid out every operational plan, in physical steps that did not invite interpretation. First, isolate the camera network from the scheduler. Second, confirm that external transmitters could be restored without broadcasting contaminated patterns. Third, extract survivors. Fourth, restore minimal relay function. Fifth, leave the station in a state that did not require constant observation to maintain. Every step had to be taken without breaking containment. That meant that any fix they applied had to be robust and simple, resistant to subtle reconfiguration. Complex solutions could hide complex vulnerabilities. Pike returned from the junctions with data that worsened the picture. The station's camera network had been assigned priority at a firmware level, not just a software configuration. Someone or something had modified the scheduler in a way that would persist across resets unless physically corrected. Voss aboard the Ardent proposed a hardware-level intervention, bypass the scheduler entirely, route external communications through a hardened secondary path, and disable the camera network at its power distribution node, rather than through software commands that could be ignored or looped. Cade approved. Simple, physical, testable. Pike and the technician moved to the station's power distribution hub. It was located behind a sealed panel that required manual override. Pike cut the panel's seal and opened it with deliberate slowness, treating the act as a ritual of control. Behind it was a cluster of conduits and breakers. The camera network's feed was labeled clearly, far too clearly, with fresh tags that had no smudges. The labeling made Pike's throat tighten. It was as if the station wanted them to find it. It was as if it wanted them to touch it. Pike did not touch it immediately. She looked away, then back, then away again, forcing her mind not to fall into the trap of staring. She placed her gloved hand on a different breaker first, confirming it with her checklist. Then she returned to the camera feed breaker and flipped it with a single controlled motion. The effect was immediate. Throughout the station, indicator lights on camera mounts went dark. Monitors that had displayed external feeds flickered and fell into blankness. In the lounge where survivors had watched the corridor feed, the screen went black. The survivors' heads turned toward it with a synchronized twitch. Their faces tightened. Their breathing became shallow. Rao watched the reaction and felt the shape of the threat more clearly than before. The monitoring loop was not just a habit, it had become a stabilizer. Removing it was like removing a crutch. The station had trained its crew to regulate themselves through watching. It was a kind of soft captivity. Rao intervened with anchors. He directed the survivors' attention to their own bodies, suit seals, glove fit, breathing pace. He guided them through a simple, repetitive, but controlled sequence. Check seal, check wrist, check breath, check partner. The repetition was deliberate and bounded. It replaced the harmful loop with a safe one. The survivors' distress eased slightly, not because they understood, but because their minds had been given a new structure. Cade used the moment of reduced observation to move. With the camera network offline, the station felt less like it was looking at them. The pressure in the mind diminished. The team advanced to the scheduler's physical core. Nim and the technician accessed the hardware bay with Pike's seal kit ready in hand. Voss guided them through the bypass procedure from the Ardent, her voice absent from the narration because Cade had chosen minimal real-time comms. Instead, Voss sent step-by-step prompts through the one-way diode, and the team followed them like instructions in a sterile lab. They installed a hardened bridge module, an old-fashioned routing device with limited function. It was not clever. It did not optimize. It did not learn. It simply moved packets in one direction under strict rules. When the module came online, Vesper Relay's external transmitters registered a new routing path. The station's rays began to handshake with neighboring relays. There was a moment when the relay's systems attempted to reroute priority back to the cameras, as if reaching for a habit that no longer existed. The bypass module ignored the request. The station's scheduler flailed in silence. Nim watched the signal emissions carefully. The 13.7 kHz carrier persisted, but its amplitude shifted. It grew angry in a way that was not emotional but structural. The static thickened, as if the noise floor had been fed more energy. Nim's hands stayed steady as she tightened her filters. She did not open the band to see what else might be hiding. She did not indulge curiosity. Curiosity was an exposure vector. The relay began to transmit real traffic again. Not the full volume it had once handled. This was a stripped-down path, but enough to restore continuity. The Horizon Accord would receive acknowledgements that contained meaning. Vessels passing through the corridor would have routing again. The Gloam Belt's thin thread of connection would be rewoven. But the threat remained. The station's internal systems were still humming with the carrier, still holding the delicate 13.7 kHz pulse beneath everything, like a whisper under a conversation. It was not leaving through the bypass module. It was trapped inside for now. Cade did not allow herself relief. She had learned that early relief was a temptation that led to mistakes. They still had survivors to extract, and extraction was where contamination often crossed thresholds. Pike prepared the quarantine corridor at the docking collar. The Ardent's isolation bay was configured to accept personnel without allowing unrestricted movement. The corridor was lined with physical barriers and decon stations. It was a place where human dignity and safety had to be balanced, and Pike did the work with a methodical gentleness. She treated every seal like a promise. The survivors moved through the corridor under Rao's supervision. Their eyes, deprived of the station's camera feeds, sought new points of focus. They stared at suit gauges. They stared at reflective surfaces. They stared at each other's helmets. The compulsion to observe had not vanished. It had simply been redirected. Rao managed the redirect consciously. He gave them safe tasks. He prevented them from clustering around any one stimulus. He avoided letting them fixate on the Ardent's open hatch as if it were a screen. Cade watched the survivors, gate, and noted the subtle thing that made the situation feel worse than any ordinary disaster. They did not behave like people escaping danger. They behaved like people continuing an assignment. The station had done something to the relationship between fear and action. It had turned fear into compliance. The last survivor, a supervisor with the posture of a person used to routine authority, paused at the threshold between Vesper Relay and the Ardent's quarantine corridor. Their helmet tilted slightly, as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. The motion was small, but the Ardent's crew noticed it. So did Rao. Nim's receiver, held close to her chest, emitted a faint change in the static. The 13.7 kHz carrier sharpened, as if the station's whisper had grown more attentive. Nim felt a surge of instinct to lift the receiver and listen deeper, to understand what the change meant. She did not. She forced herself to do what her training required. She looked away. She shifted her attention to a physical anchor, the edge of Pike's seal kit, the way the tool's metal caught the light. She let her fingers rest against the analog recorder's casing, feeling its weight. She did not seek meaning. She sought control. The supervisor stepped through the threshold, and Pike sealed the hatch behind them with a decisive motion. The Ardent's quarantine corridor became a boundary, not just of pressure and atmosphere, but of information. The station's hum remained on one side. The ship's controlled silence remained on the other. Cade and her team did not immediately retreat. Their mission was not complete until the station itself was left in a stable state that would not require constant oversight. An abandoned station could become a lure. A functioning station could become a vector. They needed to choose the lesser risk. Cade chose to restore Vesper Relay to minimal automated operation under constrained observation, then lock its internal systems into a configuration that would resist reconfiguration. She did not have the luxury of understanding the entire mechanism of the anomaly. Understanding could come later. Now she needed containment. Voss guided the installation of physical lockouts on key system nodes. Pike placed sealed tags that would reveal tampering. The technician cut power to non-essential subsystems that might become observation loops again. Nim configured the bypass module to limit traffic types, preventing high-density data streams that could carry complex patterns. Rao insisted that the station's internal logs remain messy, unfiltered, and human, because sterile logs could be rewritten too easily and because human irregularity could act as a kind of noise that resisted imposed order. The work took hours. Hours spent under a station's curated silence. Hours spent avoiding the temptation to open more screens or run more analyses. Hours spent fighting the human instinct to stare into the unknown until it confessed itself. During those hours, the team experienced the phenomenon that would later give the incident its name. It began as a coincidence, easy to dismiss. A faint contour in the static that resembled a syllable, a pressure in the ear that felt like almost hearing. The mind, trained to detect threats, tried to pin it down. Then it happened again and again. Cade, passing a corridor junction, heard the static leak faintly from an open comm panel. Within it was a shape of sound that seemed to align with a familiar sequence of phonemes, something like a name, incomplete and blurred. It was not clear enough to be proof. It was clear enough to be unsettling. Nim, listening through her filters, heard the same thing and knew it was not random. The carrier pulse was not merely present, it was being used as a scaffold. The noise floor rose and fell around it in a way that guided the brain toward recognition. Rao noted the crew's micro-reactions, the slight freezing of movement, the subtle widening of eyes behind visors, the inward draw of attention. He implemented additional anchors. He directed the team to reduce auditory exposure by limiting open panels and to keep comm repairs physical rather than exploratory. He encouraged silence not as fear, but as protection. Pike noticed that the survivors in the quarantine corridor, now resting and monitored, exhibited the same subtle listening behavior. They tilted their heads in synchrony. Their attention drifted toward vents where the station's hum might still leak through. The station was trying to be heard. It was trying to be recognized. And recognition, Rao understood, was the point. Late in the operational cycle, as the team prepared to depart, Nim performed the most delicate task of the mission. She isolated the 13.7 kHz carrier pulse for storage. She did not do so as a recording meant to be replayed. She did so as a sealed datum, captured with strict access controls, because a signature like that could be a map. It could be a warning. It could be a tool. She used an analog capture chain to avoid embedding the pattern in software layers that might reproduce it. She encoded the pulse as a simple numeric description and stored it in a restricted file container that would not allow automatic preview. She treated it like a pathogen sample. As she worked, she saw something that made her stomach feel cold despite the suit's temperature regulation. The pulse did not merely remain stable. It held a mathematical precision that suggested intentional generation. It was not a byproduct. It was not an accident. It was the spine of the entire event. The station's silence was not a lack of communication. It was a reallocation. Communication had been turned inward toward observation. The station had become a closed loop. It watched itself watching. It listened to itself listening. It fed its own attention until the rest of the frontier went quiet. Cade gathered her team in the maintenance annex for the final extraction. She did not allow a celebratory posture. She did not allow the sense of completion to bloom prematurely. She had seen missions turn deadly in the last 5 minutes because someone decided the story was already over. They conducted a final station sweep. Cameras remained offline. The bypass module maintained constrained routing. The station's traffic maps now showed actual movement, slow, limited, but real. Maintenance drones were powered, but their task lists were set to physical checks rather than surveillance sweeps. Vesper Relay would not be left to stare at itself. They sealed key compartments with Pike's tags. They placed physical notices for any future crew: approach under reduced observation, do not restore camera priority, maintain manual logs, limit live feeds, treat anomalous emission as hazard. The notices were simple and did not attempt to explain, because explanation could become invitation. Finally, they returned to the docking collar. The corridor between the maintenance annex and the airlock felt longer than it should have. The station's geometry had not changed. Their perception of it had. Every junction felt like a decision point. Every blank monitor screen felt like an absence that begged to be filled. The human mind did not like emptiness. It sought patterns the way lungs sought air. Rao watched his team's pace and noticed fatigue creeping in, the subtle slowing of movement that came when a mind had spent too long avoiding temptation. Fatigue was dangerous under Lantern 7 because tired minds reached for shortcuts, and shortcuts often involved automation, and automation often involved observation. Cade compensated by making the departure procedural, step by step, with no improvisation. Pike confirmed seals. Nim confirmed her sealed data container. Rao confirmed the survivors were secured aboard the Ardent. The technician confirmed the bypass module's physical lockouts. At the airlock, they paused only long enough to ensure the station's hatch was properly sealed behind them. Pike placed the final tag with a controlled press, a small act of punctuation that marked the end of their direct exposure. The airlock cycled. Pressure shifted. The Ardent's interior air, clean, filtered, familiar, met them like a physical reassurance. It did not erase the station's influence, but it gave them a different baseline. The ship's controlled quiet was not curated silence, it was intentional restraint. It was the difference between emptiness and discipline. The survivors were transferred into the isolation bay, where Rao began deeper screening. He recorded behavioral baselines, verified identity continuity through controlled prompts, and monitored for the subtle patterns of compelled attention. He did not treat the survivors as contaminated objects. He treated them as human beings who had been coerced by a phenomenon that exploited a normal cognitive function. In the aftermath, the Ardent pulled away from Vesper Relay with the careful patience of a vessel leaving a minefield it could not see. From the bridge, Vesper Relay looked normal again, lights blinking, arrays aligned, a functioning silhouette against the dark. To a passing freighter captain, it would have appeared restored. The corridor would resume its slow flow of commerce. The frontier would breathe again, but Cade did not feel victory. She felt containment, which was never the same thing. In her private operational log, she recorded the key facts without embellishment. Vesper Relay had ceased external traffic while maintaining internal function. The station had reallocated resources toward observation. Survivors exhibited synchronized cognitive behavior centered on monitoring loops. Disabling camera networks reduced compulsion but increased distress. A stable carrier at 13.7 kHz was present beneath the station's static across multiple systems. Minimal relay function restored through hardware bypass and constrained routing. Survivors extracted under quarantine protocol. Station left operational under physical lockouts. She also recorded something that was not a fact but a warning. The phenomenon appeared to shape attention and to reward observation loops with psychological relief. It had not attacked directly, it had trained. Nim spent the first hours after departure in the Ardent's secured analysis bay, physically separated from the main comms suite. She did not want her work to bleed into the ship's broader data environment. She worked with the same caution as someone dissecting a toxin. The 13.7 kHz pulse held steady in her sealed readouts. When she compared it against the station's baseline emissions, she found it threaded through multiple subsystems that had no reason to share harmonics. It was present in the comm scheduler, in the camera network, in auxiliary diagnostics. It appeared wherever observation systems clustered. It was not just a signal. It was a spine that other behaviors wrapped around. Nim made a decision that would later matter far more than any of them could know. She did not assume the pulse originated at Vesper Relay. She treated Vesper as a site of manifestation, not origin. That distinction mattered. Manifestations could happen anywhere. She requested older Frontier ping archives from the Ardent Secure Store, minimal datasets that had been collected over months as part of routine corridor maintenance. The files were not large. They were not rich. They were exactly the kind of mundane data that no one cared about until it became evidence. She filtered them through the same analog chain, searching not for messages, but for the presence of the pulse. She did not expect to find it. Hope under Lantern 7 was another kind of exposure. It made a person look too hard. The pulse appeared, not strongly, not consistently in amplitude, but there, hiding under static in distant pings, like a thread that had been woven through the frontier for longer than anyone had noticed. The longer she looked, the more she found it, not in every file, not in every corridor, but enough to make the idea of Vesper as a singular event collapse. The carrier was not new. It had been there, faint and patient, waiting for enough observation to give it leverage. Nim did not report the discovery in a way that dramatized it. She delivered it as a measured statement to Cade and Rao, accompanied by restricted data and strict recommendations. Under no circumstances should the pulse be played as audio. Under no circumstances should it be displayed on screens in a way that invited pattern recognition. It should be handled as metadata, numeric and sterile, until they understood more. Rao received the report and felt the shape of the problem expand. An anomaly that could be contained at a single station was one category of threat. An anomaly that had been threading itself through frontier signals for months, perhaps longer, was another. Cade listened to the facts and did not show fear. Fear was a luxury she did not allow herself to display. She looked at the starfield outside the bridge viewports and felt the frontier's vastness become something else. It was no longer just distance. It was opportunity for the signal, for the unknown, for a pattern that could hide inside ordinary static until someone gave it enough attention to bloom. The Ardent had restored Vesper Relay. The mission report would be filed as a containment success. Traffic would resume. No one would panic, because panic itself could be an exposure vector. There would be tribunal questions later, and political arguments and demands for certainty. But Cade knew what had actually happened. They had not defeated a threat. They had touched the edge of a system that noticed them when they noticed it. They had proven that discipline could keep humans intact, that method could hold the line, that a quarantine cutter with a careful crew could enter a silent station and leave without bringing the silence home. That mattered. It mattered because it meant the frontier was not helpless. It mattered because it meant humanity's strength, procedure, restraint, and collective competence was not merely a bureaucratic habit. It was a weapon against things that could not be shot. And it mattered because the 13.7 kHz carrier pulse was now in the Ardent secured archive, labeled and sealed, a clue that had cost them exhaustion and uncertainty to obtain. A clean relay should not produce a stable carrier beneath its static. Yet Vesper had. And Nim's archive had shown that Vesper was not alone. As the Ardent turned back toward the mapped lane, Captain Mara Cade kept her posture steady and her ship quiet. She let the bridge screens remain minimal. She let the crew breathe. She let the mission's containment success stand on its own. In the shadow of that quiet, she made the decision that would guide the Ardent's next days. They would treat the carrier as a lighthouse, not a song. They would follow it only through controlled windows, only with strict filters, only with the kind of humility that did not confuse curiosity with entitlement. The frontier did not care about human intent, but whatever had woven itself into the static seemed to care about something else entirely: attention. And now, somewhere in the Gloam belt, the static knew how to hold steady when humans listened. Somewhere in the noise, a pattern had learned the first rule of survival in human space. It had learned how to be found. The incident is contained, the logs are sealed, and the silence returns mostly. But containment is never the same as erasure. Every decision leaves residue. Every solution narrows the margin for the next crew who answers a quiet call in a quiet place. If this case held together, it was not because the universe was kind. It was because people followed procedure when fear suggested shortcuts. Because they chose restraint when destruction would have been easier. And because someone accepted the cost of being responsible without being remembered. This story ends here. The consequences do not. If you're listening from the dark, thank you for trusting the process. If you noticed something that didn't quite fit, you noticed correctly. And if you felt the urge to rewind, to replay, to listen again, remember, repetition is never free. until the next signal. Keep your logs clean, your attention disciplined, and your doors closed unless you are certain you know what is on the other side.